Hi everyone, welcome back to 90 Days of Good News. This is day 69 of our New Testament 90, and today we are looking at Mark chapters 15 and 16. So a little recap on yesterday, we talked about Jesus sharing the Last Supper with his dearest friends, and also we're talking about his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, sort of ahead of his arrest. We were focusing on particularly the meal of the Last Supper itself, talking about how him choosing to share these very simple symbols with his friends, it meant that each time they returned to these particular foods and drinks, it meant that they were always reminded of him, and we're encouraged to be reminded of him also, to just take part in this simple act to remember Jesus' sacrifice, and how the simplicity of it is the thing that makes it so open and accessible to all of us. Now today we're going to be reading about Jesus' trial before Pilate and his crucifixion and also his death. We also then move on to the wonderful news of his resurrection on Easter Sunday. This is such a wonderful couple of chapters. It's very intense, but just so excited to share with you this morning. So let's get started. So yeah, I will begin the way I always do, with a prayer. Father in heaven, thank you so much for this gospel. Thank you that everything that we have read over the last few weeks has just shown how accessible you are to us, how much you chose to humble yourself and come down and be a wonderful example to us. Thank you that today, even though the readings can be a little bit tough at times, this just shows your deep love for us and just how far you choose to go in order to be close to us. I pray for wisdom over familiar passages and for understanding of the things that before might have remained hidden to us. And I just pray that each person would have an open heart and mind to what you have to say to them individually, as well as just in terms of teaching and learning more about you. Amen. So Mark chapter 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things, so again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release you, the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing that it was out of self-interest that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to get Pilate to release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one that you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate, but they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into a palace, that is, praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him and twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him, and they began to call out to him, "Hail, the King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spat on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him, and when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put on his own clothes, and then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexandra and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him was the King of the Jews. They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, and at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes down to take him," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, so as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body and wrapped it in linen and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salmon brought spices so that they might anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robes sitting at the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going on ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterwards, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith, for their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands, and when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on people who are ill, and they will get well." After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it. So that's the end of our readings for today. That's the end of the Gospel of Mark as well. So tomorrow we're going to be moving on to the letters of Peter, starting with 1 Peter and then moving on. I'll just sort of briefly talk about what we've looked at today. Obviously this is the 3rd time that we've gotten to this account of the trial, the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. So you do sort of go, what else can we mention? But I'd like to just point out that what struck me a little bit, and I think this is why it's a good thing to read all 4 accounts of the Gospel, the different perspectives that you receive from each of these accounts is so fascinating. And I think particularly in Mark's Gospel, I feel like we have a real perspective of the Romans, and if you start to think about what was their view of what was going on here, and what were they witnessing, what were they being involved with. Now it doesn't go into huge detail, which is why I think it's more of their perspective, because how would we have a huge amount of their perspective or their detail? But what we do have is a look at, for example, Pilate, his sort of almost refusal to believe that there's anything wrong with Jesus, and his dealing with the whole situation and trying to back away from it a little bit. We have this perspective of the Roman soldiers who choose to mock and torture Jesus, and those of the ones who execute him as well, and then having to then offering particularly the view of the centurion, and then the sort of giving over of his body to Joseph of Arimathea. Now, I think it's quite interesting and maybe worth thinking about what were the Romans like as a culture. So one thing that is worth definitely mentioning is that they were absolute experts at crucifixion and execution. It was a part of who they were, particularly the soldiers. It was just, they travelled the whole world. You know, there was an empire for a reason. They were very good at this. They were professional executioners, and they would have done a fantastic job on Jesus. I'm not surprised. But they, if you think about what they would do, the crucifixion wasn't supposed to be a quick form of death. It was supposed to be very long, very lengthy, and most people would not have died by the time it got to evening. So quite often they would actually then break the prisoner's legs to make death come quicker, so that there would be more pressure on the chest and less room for the airway to do its work. So actually what they found in Jesus was that he died really quickly. Now, he had been beaten and tormented, but if you think about it, most prisoners probably would have been beaten and tormented for days or weeks. Jesus was only arrested the night before. He was probably quite physically very healthy. He'd been hanging out with his mates the night before, having a lovely meal. But actually, in contrast to the prisoners he was alongside, who, probably had been not eaten properly for a couple of weeks at the very least, or at least a few days. So you just sort of think, well, why then Jesus, a physically strong man compared to these probably quite weakened men, why was he the one to die first? And that's a really interesting perspective. Now, in the other Gospels, we have the final words of Jesus and the words that he gave up his spirit. So what we see there is Jesus, his choice to give up his spirit, his choice to end this. It is finished, were his final words. It is done, it is finished, completed, and that's when he dies. He breathes and he dies. And it's quite an interesting moment that we then have the perspective in Mark's Gospel of the centurion who stands there and recognizes this man giving up his spirit as the Son of God. And I think possibly what he recognises at that moment is, hang on, this is meant to be a long game of torture. He's meant to be up there for at least another 6 hours before we speed him along in his death. But actually, I've just saw him give up. He's quite strong. I don't understand what's going on. So what this centurion witnesses is the power of Jesus. The power that Jesus chooses to use in that moment is that it is his choice to give up his life. It is not the choice of someone else to take it away. And that's an important perspective that we have to remember when it comes to the crucifixion. Jesus went there willingly. He was led, yes, but he went there. He had the ability to bring himself down. He was being mocked by people. That centurion recognized that he did come down from the cross. He chose the moment that ended. And it's just it's such an amazing witness. He almost immediately is like, wow, this man was the Son of God. That's incredible. At the same time, we get that kind of image of once again, the curtain being torn in two at the temple, and that's the indicator of the Holy Spirit and the presence of God not remaining within that tight little place, but instead being free to roam. And, well, I mean, not that God was ever restricted, but he chose to be in that one place, and now he comes everywhere. He chooses to come everywhere. So we do have that perspective going along at the same time. But yeah, it's just I just find it really fascinating that we see so much of the Roman accounts here, and then we have the centurion being the person who confirms to Pilate, yeah, he died. He's already dead. It really quickly happened. So yeah, just witnessing that power of Jesus, even in those last moments, if you look for it, you see Jesus at work, Jesus being above the grave, even at that moment. Now, obviously, we then have the wonderful news that they go to the tomb, place of death, and they find life. They find angelic presences. They find the fact that Jesus is alive, and we have the accounts that he appeared before Mary, before two men on the road, before the disciples themselves, and then before crowds of people. And he commissioned his followers to then go and spread the good news that the resurrection is real. It is here. It is for us. It is a promise, and Jesus is proof of that resurrection hope that we all have. And it's just so wonderful that all of this starts with him choosing something, and I just think that's really, like I say, just really worth remembering. And worth remembering that the Romans, again, like I say, they were very good at crucifixion. They knew what they were doing. It was very much confirmed that he was dead. You know, Pilate questioned, is he really dead? Can he really possibly be dead? Yes, I have confirmed it. He is definitely dead. He's been taken to a tomb. A massive great big boulder has been rolled in front of it. And again, in one of the other gospel accounts, we actually hear that there were Roman soldiers posted outside of the tomb. So you sort of go, well, his body couldn't have been stolen. It's just a very it's good to sort of think about what was that culture of those types of people at that time, and why was it that one or two of them were struck by who Jesus was even at the moment of his death. And that's just sort of it's worth remembering the impact that the presence of Jesus has even when he appears to be in weakness, because that is such a moment of his strength. And then obviously from this, like I said before, we receive the resurrection hope. It's just so awesome. And tomorrow we're going to be hearing the perspective of one of the biggest characters of the New Testament, and this is the letters of Peter, who became one of the sort of main leaders of the early church. So it's really exciting. A couple of letters that we're going to be looking through together. So yeah, I will see you tomorrow for that. Bye.